All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. And let me tell you, this time we are diving into a question for the ages.
One for the philosophy books.
You got that right. This one's a real head scratcher. Does the end always justify the means? Ooh, I can already feel the gears turning.
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and for good reason.
It's everywhere you look, right? From history books to, like, everyday decisions.
It pops up when you least expect it, and suddenly you're wrestling with this age-old dilemma.
Okay, so speaking of wrestling with dilemmas, you sent in some seriously thought-provoking material for us to dig into, so thank you for that. We're talking a fascinating episode of the Moral Dilemmas podcast and some personal stories that really bring this whole thing to life.
Those real-life experiences add a whole other layer of complexity, don't they?
Oh, for sure. They make you realize that this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. This stuff matters. So, to kick things off, the podcast throws us right into the deep end with this wild scenario. Picture this. You're leading a village, right? Peaceful, idyllic, until bam. Enemy at the gates.
Talk about a high-stakes situation.
Right. But here's the kicker. You can save most of your people, but only by diverting the enemy to the next village over. Total annihilation for them, but your village is spared. Oof.
It's a classic thought experiment that forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about human nature.
Like, where do you even begin to grapple with that kind of choice?
Well, that's where those big philosophical heavy hitters come into play.
Utilitarianism and deontology are contenders for the morality crown. The podcast does a great job of breaking them down, and it's amazing how differently they approach the whole concept of what's right. So, for those of us who skip Philosophy 101, what are we talking about here?
Essentially, you've got utilitarianism in one corner, all about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. They're all about the outcome, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, even if it means making some tough, some might even say brutal, decisions along the way.
So in the village scenario, a utilitarian would be crunching the numbers, weighing the lives saved versus the lives lost.
Exactly. They'd argue that sacrificing one village to save a larger one results in less overall suffering, even if it feels wrong on a gut level.
Okay, so then you've got deontology stepping into the ring. They're like, hold on a minute, there are rules for a reason.
Rules, principles, moral laws, that's what they live and breathe. Deontology is less about the outcome and way more about the actions we take to get there. Certain things are inherently wrong, regardless of the circumstances or the potential positive outcomes.
So a deontologist would say that sacrificing innocent people is always wrong, even if it means potentially saving more lives in the long run. There's no wiggle room there.
Nope, no wiggle room whatsoever. They'd argue that you can't just decide whose life is worth more. It's about upholding those moral absolutes, even when it's incredibly difficult.
Wow. Two totally different approaches to the same ethical dilemma.
It highlights the incredible complexity of morality and decision-making. There are often valid arguments on both sides, which is what makes this whole conversation so fascinating.
And it gets even more complicated when you start applying these ideas to real-world situations, like the decision to use atomic bombs in World War II. The podcast brought that up, and man, it really makes you think.
Talk about a heavy example. Did ending the war and potentially saving lives in the long run justify the immediate devastation and long-term consequences? There are no easy answers there.
And it's those real-world examples that make this so much more than just a thought experiment. You know?
Absolutely. They force us to confront the real-world implications of our values and the choices we make, because it's not just about philosophical pondering, it's about how these dilemmas play out in the messy reality of being human.
And speaking of messy reality, the podcast also brought up whistleblowers, like Edward Snowden. Leaking classified information could be seen as, I don't know, harming national security.
Potentially, yes.
But it also brought to light some seriously questionable government activities. So where do you even start to draw the line there? When does the potential good outweigh the potential harm? Was there even harm?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. You've got valid points on both sides of the argument.
Some folks hail Snowden as a hero who exposed wrongdoing, while others believe he crossed a dangerous line.
And this is where that initial question, does the end justify the means, takes center stage. It's at the heart of these complex, real-world situations, forcing us to examine our own values and beliefs.
It really does make you think about the ripple effects of these decisions, both big and small. And you know me, I'm all about getting personal. So I was super intrigued by those listener stories you sent. They really bring this whole dilemma down to a more relatable level.
Oh, absolutely. They remind us that these ethical dilemmas aren't just things that happen in textbooks or history books. They're happening all around us every single day.
Yeah.
And sometimes they hit closer to home than we might expect.
Like Sarah's story, for example. Man, that one really got to me.
It's a powerful example of how these ethical dilemmas can play out in the most personal and heart-wrenching ways.
So for those who haven't had a chance to dive into the material yet, what's Sarah's story all about?
Well, Sarah's a healthcare worker who, and this is during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, found herself having to make impossible decisions. We're talking about who got access to limited ventilators.
Oh, wow. So she's literally holding people's lives in her hands.
Exactly. Talk about pressure. And her story perfectly illustrates the clash between these different moral philosophies we've been discussing. Was she leaning into a more utilitarian approach? You know, trying to save as many lives as possible with the resources available, even if it meant making excruciating choices.
Or was there a deontological aspect to her decision-making? A belief that every life deserved a chance, regardless of the odds.
It's impossible to know for sure what was going through her head, but her story underscores the emotional and psychological toll these kinds of dilemmas can take, even when someone is striving to do the right thing.
And then we have John's story, which is a whole other kettle of fish.
It really highlights how this whole end justifies the means thing isn't just limited to life or death scenarios. It shows up in our personal relationships too, and those choices can have lasting consequences.
Right, so John's story, this one really hit home for me because it's about those seemingly smaller choices, the ones that can still have some pretty big ethical implications.
Absolutely, those everyday dilemmas can really sneak up on you.
So, to bring everyone up to speed, John decided to lie to his partner about losing his job. Didn't want to stress them out, which I get it, totally understandable. But still, a lie is a lie.
Right. Right, and that's where things get interesting, because on the surface, John's actions seem justified, right? He's trying to protect his partner, and ultimately, things seem to work out for the best.
But it still makes you wonder about the slippery slope. If we're okay with bending the truth in one situation, even for noble reasons, does it make it easier to justify similar actions in the future? Where does that line get drawn?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why these white lies, as we often call them, can be so tricky.
It's like, yeah, maybe this one little white lie won't cause any major harm, but...
But what happens when those little white lies start to pile up or when the stakes get higher?
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of trust. Even if the lie is ultimately harmless, does it erode the foundation of trust in a relationship? Those are some deep waters we're wading into here.
Deep and often murky. Because the truth is, we're constantly navigating these gray areas in our relationships, our careers, even in our own minds.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like those times when you see something wrong happening, but you don't speak up because you don't want to make waves. Or maybe you tell yourself you'll deal with it later.
We've all been there. And it's those everyday choices, those seemingly insignificant moments of ethical compromise that can really chip away at our integrity over time.
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, but for our moral compass.
A very accurate analogy. And what's so sneaky about it is that it often happens without us even realizing it. We convince ourselves that we're just doing what's easiest or most convenient in the moment.
Right. It's not like we're out here plotting evil schemes. But those seemingly small compromises can add up to something much bigger if we're not careful. So how do we become more aware of those gray areas? How do we strengthen those ethical muscles, so to speak, so we're better equipped to handle these dilemmas when they inevitably arise?
Well, it starts with cultivating self-awareness, that ability to hit the pause button before we act and ask ourselves some tough questions.
Like, what kind of tough questions are we talking about here?
For starters, am I about to make a decision based on what's truly right? Or am I letting convenience, fear, or the desire for a certain outcome cloud my judgment? We need to get real with ourselves and examine those underlying motivations.
So it's like holding up a mirror to our own decision-making process and being brutally honest about what we see.
Exactly. And that's not always easy or comfortable, but that kind of self-reflection is crucial for growth.
I could see how that would be helpful. But let's be real, it's got to be easier said than done, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're all human. We all make mistakes.
Absolutely. It's a lifelong practice, not a one-time fix. But the more we engage in that self-reflection, the more we challenge ourselves to align our actions with our values, the more equipped we'll be to navigate those ethical gray areas with intention and integrity. It's like building a muscle. It takes time, effort, and sometimes, a little bit of discomfort to see those gains.
It's about progress, not perfection. I like that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the hypothetical village, those high-stakes, real-world decisions, the immense pressure on healthcare workers, even those little white lies that can chip away at our integrity.
It's been quite the deep dive.
That's for sure. So as we start to wrap things up here, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this whole "does the end justify the means" question. It's rarely a simple yes or no answer. It's a question that requires ongoing reflection, a willingness to sit with discomfort, and an understanding that there isn't always a clear right or wrong path.
It's about being okay with the gray areas, even when they make us squirm a little.
Exactly. Because those gray areas, they're where our values are truly put to the test. And ultimately, it's how we navigate those murky waters that defines who we are.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think the big takeaway here, the thing that ties all these stories together, is that the real growth, the real challenge happens right there in those messy gray areas.
Absolutely. It's easy to say we'd make the right choice in a hypothetical situation, but real life, it throws curveballs.
For sure. Real life is full of nuances and complexities that you just can't always account for. And honestly, I think that's a good thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It means we're always learning, always evolving, always fine-tuning that internal compass of ours.
And it reminds us that we have the power to choose how we show up in those tough moments, even when there's no easy answer, no clear right or wrong.
It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress and that those messy, uncertain situations are often the most powerful catalysts for growth.
So as we wrap things up here, I want to leave you with this. We've explored some pretty intense dilemmas today.
From global conflicts to those quieter, more personal struggles, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But at the end of the day, I think the real work, the real opportunity for growth, lies in how we approach those smaller, everyday ethical crossroads.
Those moments when we're tempted to take the easy way out, even if it means compromising our values.
Exactly. It's about bringing that same level of intentionality and thoughtfulness to those seemingly small choices that we often brush off as no big deal.
Because they do matter. They shape our character, our relationships, and the kind of impact we have on the world around us.
I'm feeling so inspired to go out there and make some ethically sound choices. But in all seriousness, folks, I hope this conversation has given you a lot to reflect on.
It's been a pleasure diving into these complex questions with you.
Likewise. And remember, this conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep those brain gears turning. Talk to your friends and family about these dilemmas. And if you're feeling up to it, head over to our social media and share your thoughts with us.
We love hearing from you.
We do. Because at the end of the day, it's through open and honest dialogue that we learn and grow together. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and as always, keep diving deep.